Hello, my name is John Botton. I'm a former history teacher and historian and a lifelong Bible student. And so this particular subject is really interesting to me, and I hope will be really interesting to you as we explore it together. Let's start off by reminding ourselves about what the Exodus in the Bible is all about. It's about how God rescued the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. It's about how they were taken through the wilderness, led by Moses, and this took 40 years before they reached what is described as the Promised Land, the land there shown as Canaan. It starts off in Genesis with Joseph, the one who was famous for the coat of many colors, and who had been sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, but then became the means by which God looked after his people, his family, Jacob his father and his other 11 brothers, and preserved them in a time of great famine. And Joseph became second only to the Pharaoh of his day. Go forward hundreds of years, and you come to the time when the people of Israel had become slaves. They had multiplied so quickly the Egyptians became worried, and so they tried to stop them growing as a nation and, if possible, assimilate them into the Egyptian nation. In the time of Moses, God sent Moses to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt. And the way in which he did this was through 10 really severe plagues which were sent on the Egyptians by God, starting with the waters of the Nile and other water being turned to blood, and ending up with the killing of the firstborn of all the people of Egypt. After that, we read in the book of Exodus that the Israelites were able to escape from the Egyptians when they pursued them by the Red Sea being parted and the Israelites being able to cross over on dry ground. They then spent a considerable time at Mount Sinai, where God gave them the 10 Commandments and a special covenant to make them his own particular people and a very special nation to him. But because they failed to keep that covenant, they ended up spending 40 years in the wilderness before Joshua led the people into the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Now, this is a major event in the whole of the Bible. It's recorded in 5 books, particularly from the Exodus, the book of Exodus itself, through Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and into the book of Judges. So it's a very substantial part of the Bible record. Some archaeologists have claimed that it didn't take place. They say there are no traces of the Israelites in Egypt at any time. They doubt the biblical account of Jacob and his sons going down into Egypt, and they doubt even more the biblical account of them being released from slavery by the hand of God in the leadership of Moses. And yet the Exodus is one of the most prominent events in the Bible. It's a really, really important part of the Bible record, and it is still highly regarded by Jews as part of their history and their heritage. And there are over 120 direct references in the Bible, the rest of the Bible, and in these books, to the Exodus as an event. So it's very prominent in Bible teaching, not something which is a kind of small part of the narrative. It is a very important and significant part of the narrative. There are lots and lots of references to the key characters. Moses, over 800 references in the Bible. Aaron, his brother, the first high priest, 330 references. There are lots of references to what is called the covenant, the special agreement which God made with the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And there are also references to the Passover, crossing the Red Sea, and so on. These are direct references, and when you look at the Bible carefully, there are lots of other allusions, partial references, passing comments related to the Exodus. It's a really important part of the Bible. But, as I said earlier, there are those who have suggested that it's not true at all. It's completely false, a myth. A myth, they claim, which was made up at the time when the Old Testament was put together in the form which we have it, about 600 years or so before the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. So how can we look at this accusation that these events didn't take place? Well, we first of all need to look at Egyptian history and how we know about ancient Egypt. Obviously, we have these magnificent pyramids and Sphinx. We have also, however, a lot of hieroglyphs. Now, in ancient Egypt, there were undoubtedly written documents as well, but the inundation of the Nile, the flooding of the Nile each year, regularly destroyed these official records. The records carved in stone were, of course, much more lasting, and hieroglyphs were a form of picture writing. And here are some from the temple of Kom-Ombo in Egypt. The problem was that for a very, very long time, nobody knew what these symbols meant. And it wasn't until a young Frenchman called Francois Champollion in the early 19th century studied the Rosetta Stone that he managed to work out the meaning of the hieroglyphs. The Rosetta Stone had been found by the troops of Napoleon when they were campaigning in Egypt in 1799. And Champollion, when he was still a young man, set himself to study carefully the Rosetta Stone. It was particularly helpful because it had the same message in 3 different types of language. And by comparing the 3 languages, one of which was the hieroglyphic, Champollion was eventually able to work out what the hieroglyphs meant. And so when he managed to do that and to show other people how hieroglyphic writing worked, this opened up a vast area of new evidence. Because in addition to the inscriptions on the walls of many of the temples and tombs of the pharaohs, there were a few parchments like this one with hieroglyphic writing and illustration on it. So once hieroglyphic writing was understood, then the whole evidence of ancient Egypt was opened up to much greater study. It was not only on the external walls of temples, but also inside the pyramids, in these elaborate rooms where the pharaohs were entombed in great splendor, all the magnificent paintings on the wall that give us a lot of evidence about the life and habits of the ancient Egyptians. And of course, inside the tombs, there were often mummies. This one is very interesting, but it happens to be of a pregnant woman. You can see on the right-hand image, there is an image of the baby developing in the womb. So gradually it was possible to begin to piece together some of the evidence about ancient Egypt. But there was one big problem. There was no clear dating system. Now, we, by and large, in the West, use the system based on before the time of the Lord Jesus Christ, now also known as before the Christian era, and after the time of the birth of Jesus, used to be called Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, now sometimes described as the Christian era. So we have a starting point for dates, and we can date various events in reference to this starting point. The problem was there wasn't any such starting point available in Egyptian history, or at least so it seemed. There were various monuments where pharaohs had carved into the walls of temples and fabulous buildings which they built, lots of records of their triumphs, but they were not set against a particular form of calendar which enabled people to say, yes, that's so many years, BC, AD, whatever it might be. Instead, what those who discovered these inscriptions did was to work out which pharaohs they belonged to. They could usually work out from the inscriptions how long the particular pharaohs had reigned, and then they tried to sort of put them all together, one after the other, and this enabled them to, Egyptologists, to establish a framework in which they understood a whole series of dynasties, families of rulers in Egypt, pharaohs in Egypt, in all over 29 of these, going back for a long time into the past. So they began to classify the ancient Egyptian dynasties by dynastic periods. You can see them listed here on this slide. But there was still no clear date for the reign of any individual pharaoh. What I mean by that is, much as we know on what year Queen Elizabeth I began to reign, what year she died, they didn't have that sort of information. They only had information in relation to the length of pharaoh's rule and sometimes the relationship of different pharaohs to each other in these various dynasties. So this was a difficult task. Now, Champollion was a very biblically minded man. He wanted to show, when he first went to Egypt to study these things more closely, he wanted to show that the Bible and Egyptian history fitted into each other. And he found in Karnak this bubastite portal doorway, it's a very large wall, the record of a particular pharaoh called Shoshenq. Now, in the Bible, in the record in Kings, we're told that after the time of the very famous King Solomon, about 1,000 years before Christ, when his son Rehoboam took over, the country of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was split into two parts, the north and the south. It was also attacked by an Egyptian pharaoh who in the Bible record is described as Shishak. Champollion looked at the name Shishak, and he'd come across in his studies of Egypt a pharaoh called Shoshenq. And he said to himself, this has got to be the same person. He produces evidence this particular wall record, which was a record on the wall and the various hieroglyphs of Shoshenq's wars. And he then said to himself, well, we have a pretty good idea of when Shishak, in the Bible account, attacked Jerusalem. And therefore, if we can go from that time, about 925 years before Christ, and say that's the time of Shoshenq, then this will give us a good fixed point for establishing a proper Egyptian chronology. Unfortunately, it's now pretty certain that this was not a proper correspondence, that Shishak and Shoshenq were not the same person. It was based on the inscription. There's the record. It's in 1 Chronicles chapter 12 in the Bible, where it talks about Shishak. But this inscription of Shoshenq's, in the end, has been shown to have nothing whatsoever to do with the Egyptian pharaoh's invasion in the time of Shishak. The two things, on careful examination, are plainly not about the same event. For example, in this record on the wall, there are lists, representations of the various cities which Shoshenq captured in his campaign, which he did have at another time, into the land we know as Israel. Unfortunately, it completely failed to mention the most important place which the biblical Shishak had attacked, which was Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem, Shishak had stolen, taken back to his country, all the golden shields which Solomon, during his reign, his powerful and very prosperous reign, had accumulated and stored in the temple which he had built. So this fixed date of about 925 BC was then used by other Egyptologists who at the time believed, and some still do, that Shishak and Shoshenq were the same person, to fix a date of around 925 years before Christ for the reign of Shoshenq I. They then worked back from that date to establish as much as they could of dates for the different dynasties prior to that time, prior to Shoshenq's time. And this led them to another conclusion, that the pharaoh who would have been in power at the time of the Exodus was Ramses II. Now, we know from other records of ancient Egypt that Ramses II was one of the two greatest pharaohs of the whole of the period of the Egyptian power, which stretched over many, many centuries. Incidentally, his name wasn't Ramesses. That was a Greek version of the name. His name was much different from that. And his shortened name was Sisi, or Sisa. And you can see at that point it's not too far away from Shishak. But the Egyptologists said, no, this is way, way before the time of King Solomon and King Rehoboam in Israel and Shishak, the Pharaoh, attacking Jerusalem. This is the time of the Exodus. And then they said, that's given us a big problem. Well, it's given you, they said, as Bible believers, a huge problem. Because when we look at the archaeological and other evidence at the time of this Pharaoh, Ramses II, we can find no evidence whatsoever of an Exodus. We cannot find at that time any evidence of Jewish people ever having been in Egypt, or being slaves, or having escaped from slavery by the miraculous intervention of God at the time of Moses. These things, they said, simply didn't happen. So they simply said, well, this must be a myth. This is a myth invented centuries later to try and bolster national feeling, and there's no truth in it whatsoever. We can't find any evidence in Egypt. It must be false. It must be a myth. They also claimed that the city of Jericho, which the Bible account tells us at the end of the Exodus, just at the time when Joshua took over from Moses and led the people of Israel into the promised land, that city had not been there when the Bible said Joshua had attacked it. It had actually been destroyed a long time earlier, and therefore the record in Joshua must be wrong. Now, at this point, we need to think about the Bible itself as historical evidence. In any other circumstances, as historians, we would look very carefully and take very seriously a substantial piece of evidence. The book of Exodus and the books which follow are substantial level of evidence. They cover about 200 pages in the Bible, and that's about 15% of the whole book. They cover a period over 40 years, giving lots of detail as to what happened during that time when the Israelites were in the wilderness. They tell us that there were more than 40 places where the Israelites camped in the wilderness. They give us a huge amount of detail particularly on the religious laws developed during that time, but also on the events of that time. They are very complex. They are cross-referenced within the books of the accounts of the Exodus journey, but they're also cross-referenced to lots of other places in the rest of the Bible, as we saw earlier. Hundreds and hundreds of references. This is a lot of the Bible. This is not a small amount. And therefore, it is a bit perverse for Egyptologists or other historians to say, well, we're not going to take any notice of that at all. We don't think any of it's true. Apart from anything else, it is a substantial written source. It needs to be carefully considered alongside other sources. And it would have been very difficult to forge such an extraordinary account. It doesn't read, I'm a historian, I was particularly interested when I taught history in the nature of historical evidence, it doesn't read like a forgery. In any case, why would you forge this story? What would be the point? Now, at this point, you'll recognize you've got a problem, and you might like to add a comment in the comment section on the site. You might want to raise some questions here. But the biggest question is this. If the majority of Egyptologists, even today, believe that the biblical account is not true, can it be shown to be true despite their skepticism and their insistence that the Israelites weren't in Egypt, or they weren't in Egypt at the right time, and that the Exodus and the plagues and the journey through the wilderness didn't take place? Now, at this point, we need to take a careful look at what's happened since the time of Champollion. As I said, the majority of Egyptologists still insist that the chronology which he established based on identifying the pharaoh of Egypt called Shishak in the Book of Chronicles with Shoshenq I, that this chronology is broadly correct. And they've continued to insist this. But a minority of historians have questioned Champollion's conclusions. This questioning goes back quite a considerable time. Now, one of the earliest people to question it was a man called Immanuel Velikovsky, who wrote a book called The Age of Chaos in 1953. And he began to challenge what's called the conventional chronology of Egypt based on Champollion's assertion that Shishak and Shoshenq were the same person. Velikovsky had some strange ideas, but he was one of the first to seriously query this view. He was followed by others, Donovan Corbin, The Exodus Problem, Peter James, Centuries of Darkness, particularly highlighting why was it that in Greek history and Hittite history and other histories of the ancient Near East, where the chronology had been based and derived from the Egyptian chronology, called the conventional chronology, why was it in each of these there was a period of 400 years, 300-400 years, when nothing appeared to happen? A dark age in Greece, a dark age in the Hittite lands as well. But the most prominent critic of this conventional chronology has been David Rohl. And this started with an expansion of his research as a student into a book and television series. The book was called A Test of Time, published in 1995, and the television programs first aired under the title Pharaohs and Kings, and you can still see those on the internet. Others after that time, Dale Murphy, Roger Waite, and others, began to question this conventional chronology, and they were persistent in pointing out that there were some fundamental mistakes in the way in which Champollion had identified Shoshenq I as the Shishak of the biblical account, and how the dating of everything prior to that time in Egyptian history had depended on that false conclusion. Shoshenq's campaign in Israel was shown not to relate to the time of King Rehoboam and Shishak. The cities which he attacked weren't in the southern part of the kingdom where Rehoboam reigned, but in the northern part. There was no reference to him going anywhere near Jerusalem. And the whole point of the record in the first book of Chronicles in the Bible is that the Shishak took away the treasures of the temple in Jerusalem, which Rehoboam paid him off with to get him out to stop him attacking the country further. But Jerusalem doesn't appear on this wall at all. Some of the other conclusions of Champollion were wrong also. And David Roll in particular has been very successful in pointing out from other evidence throughout Egypt that this original assertion that Shoshenq and Shishak were the same person is completely wrong, and that therefore the chronology of ancient Egypt is also wrong. David Roll has gone on to suggest that the pharaoh Shishak who attacked Jerusalem was in fact Ramesses II, who we met earlier. And he gives a very convincing argument in relation to this, related to the name of Ramesses. Remember I said earlier one of the Ramesses' shortened names was Sisa or Sise, and he shows that this is most likely to be the pharaoh who attacked Jerusalem. And how this fits into the general narrative of what Ramesses did. We do have records that Ramesses actually attacked Jerusalem. In some of his records, it plainly says so in the hieroglyphics telling of his reign. At this point, Roll then said, well, actually, we've got the conventional chronology wrong by over 300 years. This is not correct. As you can imagine, this has caused consternation amongst Egyptologists who have spent their life, staked their lives almost on saying the conventional chronology was absolutely right. You can see in this chart the comparison of the conventional Egyptian chronology on the top line and the new Egyptian chronology, the new chronology is called, on the second row, and at the bottom the biblical chronology. And here for the first time, at the end of the 12th dynasty and the 13th, beginning of the 13th dynasties, there is some obvious connections between the time of the Exodus and the archaeological finds. So this brings us to a time where there's a wealth of evidence of the Exodus. We can actually see evidence of the time when the Israelites were in Egypt, at the time of Jacob and his sons and Joseph, evidence that they were there for some time, hundreds of years, and evidence that they then left in circumstances as described in the Bible. So what is this evidence? Let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. Now, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, it talks about the Israelites having built a city called Ramses for the pharaoh of that name. But that was clearly a later name by which it was known. Now, for example, the Romans, it is said in English history, set up one of their capitals in York. Except, of course, it wasn't York in those days. We know it's York today because that's what it was afterwards called. Eboracaurum was the name in Roman times. And the same appears to have happened with this city of Avaris, later called Ramses, but previously known as Avaris, and now discovered as the apparent center in the land of Goshen, which was in the Nile Delta, of the area settled by Joseph's descendants. Now, on this little plan of the area, which has been excavated extensively over the last few decades, you can see there is a particular area shown here as an early Israelite settlement. This appears to be where Israelites settled in the land of Goshen. There were other areas. These were all islands in the delta of the River Nile. When the Nile flooded, they were separated up into islands. When the Nile was low, it would have been possible to cross the bed of the Nile in many paces. Up here is a city later on known as Pi-Ramesses. So this is the time, the further extension of the city in the time of Ramesses later on in Egyptian history. But Avaris, it is clear from the excavation, was the city where the Israelites settled, where the sons of Jacob settled. One of the interesting things which David Roll came across when he looked at numerous inscriptions and illustrations across Egypt was this picture of Semitic people in colourful clothes coming into part of Egypt. This is the only inscription of its kind, and almost that these are the only people ever shown in coloured clothes. And David Roll suggests this perhaps an interesting connection to the idea of the coat of many colours of Joseph. In the later years of Joseph, one of the things they discovered in Avaris was that it was a very fine palace. They found in that palace a very, very damaged statue. This is an artist's reconstruction of what it looked like. Now, what is noticeable about this is, again, the highly decorated coat, many colours. This statue stood in or adjacent to a particular burial place, which we'll come back to in a minute. But this looked extremely like the palace of an extremely important person. Joseph was vizier, or second in command to Pharaoh, the Bible tells us that. And this appears to have been most likely the place where Joseph, towards the end of his days, retired, given land and help to build the palace by grateful pharaohs, because he had helped to deliver Egypt from a period of famine, 7 years of famine. Interestingly enough, David Roll has established, by looking at other Egyptian records of the inundations of the Nile, a particular period when records were kept where actually there were a whole series of floods. This is interesting to me. I hadn't come across this before doing the research for this broadcast, but he suggests that it was flooding which caused the famine because it made the land impossible to cultivate, and not a shortage of rain as had been previously believed. In this city of Avaris, there was clear evidence of Semitic, that is, Jewish occupation. Some of it was the remains of these very fine daggers. These are the sort of things which, if you were a chieftain, a very senior person in the clan or tribe, you would have as ornamental and decorative items symbolizing your status and power. The Semitic graves were different from the Egyptian graves because the Jews were buried on their sides and not on their backs, as was the case with Egyptian burials, traditional Egyptian burials, and as we see in the many tombs of the pharaohs which have been discovered. So there is the reconstruction of Joseph's palace at Avaris. You will see not only the palace itself, but up further in the corner here, pointing the arrow, you can see there is a special type of tomb. And here it is. This is a little model to show what it was like. Now, this is very unusual. This was a Jewish settlement, an Israelite settlement. And yet, this particular person, this high official who the palace had been built for, was accorded the high honor of having a small pyramid tomb created for him. And in the tomb, in the entrance area there, was where they think the statue, which was quite a tall statue, had stood. This clearly fits in with the idea that this is Joseph's tomb, and David Rohl gives a lot of evidence in relation to this. One of the bits of evidence is particularly striking. When Joseph was dying, the Bible tells us, he told his children and his brothers that when God eventually visited his people and brought them back to the land he had promised them, the land known as Canaan, or today Israel, then they were to take his body with them back to the land of promise and bury it there. And one of the most interesting features of the excavation within what was left of this little pyramidal tomb was that there was no body. The tomb was there, the place where the body was laid, would have been laid, was there, absolutely no bones and no body, not even a mummy, no mummy at all or anything like that. And it's quite possible that Joseph's body would have been mummified at the time. So this looks remarkably like Joseph's tomb. Now, if we go on further from the time of Joseph, say several hundred years to the time of Moses, then another feature of Avaris becomes extremely interesting. This is a kind of reconstructed view of what the city might have looked like. When they looked at the graves in Avaris, there were about twice as many male deaths as they would have expected in normal circumstances. Now, if you go back and read the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were increasing in number very rapidly, the Egyptians turned against them. They tried to stop their number increasing any further. So they said to the Jewish midwives and people, we want to stop the rise of the Jewish population, the Israelite population. You are to kill all the small baby boys. And plainly the objective was that then the baby girls, the Israelite women, would gradually be married off to Egyptians, and by that means they would be absorbed into the Egyptian nation and become loyal subjects. So they were told to kill the baby boys. There are twice as many male deaths as would have been expected. The number of adult females, again, this can be checked from the graves in Avaris, outnumbered the males by 3 females to every 2 males. Now, obviously, if you are killing off the baby boys, then this is going to happen over a period of time. And in particular, also, there were a large number of male infant graves, very small graves, very small indeed. Clearly graves of newborn male infants. This fits with the biblical account which we have in the book of Exodus, how the Egyptians tried to absorb and exterminate the Israelite people. It's also been discovered that at Avaris, a little bit down from up the river actually towards the north, from where the Jewish Israelite area was, there was a large palace, looks as though it might well have been Pharaoh's summer palace. And this would account for the biblical account of how the parents of Moses, when they couldn't hide Moses anymore, they put him in a basket and he floated down in the direction of Pharaoh's palace and was there found amongst the reeds on the river's edge. Now, there's another thing which is really interesting about Avaris, and it's this. There's evidence that there was a sudden disaster in Avaris, in parts of Avaris, and that the population of the Israelite area suddenly left. There's evidence of sudden departures. In the non-Israelite areas, there's evidence of sudden death. There are large, what are sometimes described today as plague pits, where bodies have been thrown in haphazardly, and it's at that point that actually the Israelite population left. There's archaeological evidence that part of the city at least was deserted for a considerable period of time until the Hyksos, kings who came in from the area of Canaan itself and took over the land of Egypt for quite a couple of centuries, until they rebuilt part of the area, and later on Ramses II also rebuilt it. So this is a really interesting situation. Now, one of the other things which evidence from Avaris and elsewhere suggests is that actually there was a sudden disaster in Egypt itself. At the end of the 12th and 13th dynasties, disaster seems to have struck the pharaohs of Egypt. And again, this accords with the biblical account of the Egyptians pursuing the Israelites after they left the land, being hustled out by the Egyptians because they were frightened of what might happen to them next if they didn't get rid of the Israelites. When they pursued them and tried to pursue them across the Red Sea, that their army came to disaster and Pharaoh himself was killed. There are other records which suggest that this in fact was what happened, that there was a disaster, that the Hyksos invaders were able to march in almost unopposed because of the weakening of the Egyptian rule at that time. So there are some of these plague pits with the bodies thrown in haphazardly. This was preceded the city being abandoned at the time of the exodus of the Israelites. Sudden death and plague having hit them. So Joseph's tomb was left empty because when the Israelites left, they did as they had been asked to do and took his body with them. But the statue of Joseph, which was left, was defaced and vandalized by Egyptians, presumably either soon after or perhaps a long time after, who were so angry about what had happened. Now, the Israelites then spent 40 years in the wilderness. At the end of that time, just after the death of Moses, the Bible tells us that Joshua took the people across the River Jordan and they began to capture the cities of the land. And the first city they captured was Jericho. And Jericho was the place where, after the Israelites had walked around the city, processed around the city in silence for 7 whole days, on the 7th day, they walked around it 7 times. When they blew the trumpets, the Bible says the walls fell down. Now, the interesting thing is that when these city ruins were first excavated by Flinders Petrie in the 19th century, he did find evidence of collapsed walls. The walls had collapsed outwards and that actually the city had subsequently been burned. In the 20th century, an archaeologist called Kathleen Kenyon came along and said, yes, that's what happened, but it didn't happen in the time of Joshua, because she was convinced that the conventional chronology of Egypt ruled out this any synchronicity, any timing of Joshua's attack having a connection with the ruin of the city, of the first city of Jericho. And so she stridently asserted that Joshua attacked a city which wasn't there, that it wasn't as the book of Joshua described, and that the Bible must be wholly wrong, and that the whole thing was nonsense. Now, Jericho has recently been revisited because when this was looked at again, and of course now using the new chronology, which David Roll and others had shown to be a very well-evidenced chronology for Egypt, which moved the chronology of Egypt by 300 years. Now looking at it as it was in the Middle Bronze Age, this became the right time for the destruction of Jericho as the archaeological evidence described and as the Bible tells us. So the people shouted, the wall fell down flat, and they went up into the city. Now you can see there were two walls. There was an upper mud brick wall, there was a lower mud brick wall, and there was a steep slope between them, which made it almost impossible under normal circumstances to attack the city walls. But once the walls fell down and fell down outwards, then this made it much easier. And the Bible account says that the people under Joshua then went up into the city and destroyed it and set it on fire. The evidence which is there plainly suggests this is correct, that the walls of Jericho fell in 1406 BC. The date of the Exodus under the new chronology having been identified as 1446, 40 years earlier. And they found all sorts of other evidence to bear this out: imitation Cypriot ware, pottery, which Kathleen Kenyon had discovered was rechecked and it was shown to be misdated. And the destruction there was in the late Bronze Age, dating from 1406 years before the birth of Jesus. So once again, this showed evidence that these things were actually true. Now, you might want to look at this more closely. Let me say at once that David Roll is not a Bible believer as such. He declares himself to be agnostic. But what he does say, and the evidence plainly points to, is that there is evidence, if you look at the right time, there is plenty of evidence of the exodus from Egypt, of the existence of the Israelite people in the Darius at the time of Joseph, and the exodus at the time of Moses. And he gives further evidence from other sources, astronomical sources, and other evidence of pottery and so on and so forth. As a historian, I have to say that the evidence is extremely comprehensive and appears to be utterly reliable. And you can see at the foot of this slide the reference to the video. It's a long video, 2015 minutes, but well worthwhile watching in sections to see the full detail of what David Roll discovered. Now, you might still be saying to yourself, right, okay, I believe that Joseph was in Egypt. I believe that Joshua destroyed the city of Jericho exactly as is described in the book of Joshua. But why isn't there more evidence of the time these Israelites in the wilderness? After all, the Bible records suggest there were about 2 million of them. Surely such a large body of people moving through wilderness over 40 years would have left a lot of evidence of their passing. Well, this is just a brief coverage of this point. First point I would make is this: they weren't in any one place for any length of time. The Bible tells us there were 46 places where they stopped. The longest stay was for 1 year at Mount Sinai. So they weren't in other places for as long as that. So 46 different places. They were temporary residents in these places, and they were traveling with tents and other portable items. They hadn't set out to build houses or anything like that. The tabernacle, the center of their worship, which God had told them to put together, was designed deliberately to be portable. You carried it from place to place and set it up in one place after another. They had no permanent buildings. There would therefore be no ruins to be found. Another factor is, of course, in the Sinai Desert, there's not been very much archaeological investigation, and the shifting landscape, the sands and so on, make it difficult to excavate. But we are talking about events nearly 3,500 years ago, so perishable items, human remains disappeared. Everything else they took with them on the journey to the promised land of Israel, pots, pans, clothes, and shoes, they would have taken with them on their journey and not left behind. So it's not surprising that we don't find much evidence. It's quite interesting to see some sources and some historians point out that if you tried to follow Bedouin accounts from the 19th and 20th century, you wouldn't find Bedouins, by the way, were wandering Arab settlers who grazed their sheep and cattle in various places, that you wouldn't find much evidence of them either, even from fairly recent centuries. So, to me, as a historian, as someone who's really interested in historical evidence, this is all very compelling evidence. But the greatest evidence of all is the evidence in the New Testament, because it comes from the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So what would we find? In the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, the centre of the teaching of Jesus given in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus repeatedly said, "You've heard it was said in old time, but I say to you this." And the things which he's quoting to his listeners are from the laws of Moses, the law of Moses from the book of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and so on. So Jesus repeatedly refers to these events of the Exodus as actual events. At no time did Jesus ever suggest that it was a myth. For example, on the occasion we're told of the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, on the next day the people come back to him and said, "We'd like some more, please." And Jesus says to them, "Don't labour for the meat that perishes, but for that which lasts to eternal life." He then talks to them about, "Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness," that's during the wilderness journey, "and are dead. But I can give you the bread of life, which will give you life eventually forever in my kingdom." So Jesus builds on the teaching of the Old Testament. On another occasion, he talks to them about one of the occasions in the wilderness journey when they were plagued with poisonous snakes. And Moses was told by God to set up a serpent on a pole, on a bronze pole, and everybody who looked at that serpent was healed. And he says, as Moses lifted up the serpent, so the Son of Man must be lifted up also. And this is obviously clearly a reference to the crucifixion and to the position of Jesus as the ultimate saviour from sin and death. And of course, this keys in also to the repeated descriptions, for example, in John chapter 1, where Jesus comes to be baptized by John the Baptist. And John Baptist says to his own disciples, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And it's a direct reference to the Passover lamb. So we would find, if we look carefully in the New Testament, lots and lots and lots of references by Jesus to these events as wholly factual. And in the rest of the New Testament, we find the same thing. Stephen, the disciple who was the first Christian to be put to death, in his speech to the Jewish rulers in the Sanhedrin, Acts chapter 7, takes them through the history of the Exodus and plainly endorses that this is a factual account, this is a truthful account. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, he again says, look, you've got to remember what happened to our forefathers in the wilderness. And he's talking not only to Jewish Christians, but also to Gentile Corinthian Christians, non-Jewish Christians. And yet he says these things are written for our learning. He takes them through some of those events. They pass through the sea in the same way we pass through the waters of baptism to become Christians. They were led through the wilderness in the same way as we are led by the teaching and the promise of Jesus through our lives to the promise of his kingdom, which is represented by the promised land in the whole epic of the Exodus as a tale of salvation from slavery, sin, and death. And of course, in the letter to the Hebrews, which was written not long before the time when Jerusalem was going to be destroyed by the Romans, and the temple, which they had such great pride in, totally destroyed, and their religious centre completely dispersed. That letter to the Hebrews repeatedly refers to what happened in the time of the Exodus to show how much better the promise of the Lord Jesus Christ as the Messiah is, and that they did not need to have a temple such as Herod's temple. because they had the promise of the new covenant in Jesus Christ. Perhaps this is the most interesting verse of all the things Jesus says, because he almost anticipating that there would come a time when people would say, oh, we don't believe in the Exodus, we don't believe these things happened, don't believe in Moses and what it tells us about him. He says, when he talks to his disciples, don't think that I will accuse you before the Father, he means God. One who accuses you is Moses, in whom you set your hope. If you believe Moses, you'll believe me, for he wrote about me. And what Jesus is saying is that to believe about Moses, about the Exodus, about the purpose of God in that wonderful epic account in the Old Testament is essential, because this is also about the gospel of Jesus Christ, which brings life and hope to us. So what are our conclusions? The Exodus is one of the central teachings of the whole of the Bible, set out in detail. It's repeatedly referred to. It's endorsed by the Lord Jesus Christ, who we believe to be the Son of God, and therefore someone who should know, shouldn't he? And the other inspired writes the New Testament, because that's what the Bible says. They were not speaking of their own selves, but they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. They spoke the words of God. And provided we look in the right place in history, according to the new chronology, there is very good historical evidence the Exodus took place exactly in the way described in the Bible. We can trust these things. Time and again over the centuries, the Bible has been vindicated eventually by archaeologists and others as new discoveries have been made. New discoveries have been made, and they show plainly that the Exodus is God's truth and not a myth which came from man long after the event. Now, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You can do so by clicking on the logo, and also we would be very pleased to have your comments in the comments box beneath this broadcast, and we look forward to seeing the next program in this series, which will be looking at the kings, the time of the kings, and why we can trust what the Bible says about those as well. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Goodbye.